Do you believe skin bleaching is a form of self-hate or just a style? Please explain the reason for your answer.
It's self-hate for me because if it is that you understood the damage and the implications, you would be aware that you're damaging your skin. And I don't think anybody would consciously want to damage their skin if they like their skin. So if you look at your skin and you see something that you don't like, you're going to try and change it. So once you want to change what is there because you don't like it, it's self-hate. And it is because you were not taught that this skin is a badge of honor. It is not a badge of shame. But because socialization again and society has been so big on the Browning syndrome, and it's a fact, around you, you see that. If you walk into a store, when we were studying as students in Barbados, the dark-skinned ones among the dark-skinned among us, when we go to Cave Shepherd, we would be followed, and we would be going with other students who have lighter skin. And when you look across, you're the only one who they're following, and the brown-skinned one is being treated as a regular tourist. You know, so the attention and the focus is negative towards you. And so it makes some people who are not firm in who they are want to say, if life don't have to be so hard, me not want that black skin here, me I go change it because this black skin is the reason for my problems and I don't like it. So self-hate. Not enough people appreciate that and believe it, that nothing is wrong with your skin being black. Some people will say it, but they don't believe it. I remember I had a lady before me a time in court, and she was in her 50s, and she told me that over the last 2 years was the first time in her life that she was looking at herself in the mirror and appreciating her reflection. She said she never used to look in the mirror because she grew up hearing that she black and ugly, and she believed it. She said she didn't like to look in the mirror because she didn't like what she was seeing. And she said it was at a church service she was, and the pastor was preaching about bleaching and people and black skin and brown skin. And she said when the pastor preached, and she said this is somebody who would go to church regularly, but this one sermon made a difference for her because it touched on an issue that she herself was grappling with from childhood. And for the first time, she was confronted to think about it now in the context of how the pastor was presenting it. And she said when she went home, she cried, and she said she said to herself, she have to look at herself in the mirror today. And she said to do that, what she had to do to get to that, to just stand up and look in the mirror, she said it felt like somebody was lifting a heavy weight off her shoulder. And she said since that moment, she has not looked back. She said she didn't realize what she was missing out on her self or for herself all of this time, because now she said you can't take her out the mirror. She look in the mirror for everything. She look in the mirror, even when she don't need to look in the mirror, she look in the mirror like she's making up for all the last years of not looking in the mirror. But it is self-hate, and it is because we were taught to hate ourselves. We were taught that yes, it's a white Jesus, go and save you, because we grew up seeing the white Jesus on the almanac in our houses. So you were always taught that always look up to the person who is brown or white, because see, then bring Jesus to you as a white man. Only when you get older you unlearn these things. The same thing, certain jobs, that is brown people or the white people going to get it. So you are made to feel that you're less than. So you're going to hate your skin because it's your skin is the reason that you're not going to get this job that this white person or this brown person is going to get. So self-hate, it was made a live thing. We were taught to hate ourselves.
Who can imagine what could be the feelings of a father and mother when looking upon their infant child whipped and tortured with impunity and placed in a situation where they could afford it, no protection. But we are all claimed and held as property. The father and the mother were slaves. I was compelled to stand and see my wife shamefully scourged and abused by her master. And the manner in which this was done was so violently and inhumanely committed upon the person of a female that I despair in finding decent language to describe the bloody acts of cruelty. My happiness or pleasure was then all blasted, for it was sometimes a pleasure to be with my family, even in slavery. I loved them as my wife and child. Little Frances was a pretty child. She was quiet, playfully bright, and interesting. But I could never look upon the dear child without being filled with sorrow and fearful apprehensions of being separated by slaveholders because she was a slave, regarded as property. And unfortunately for me, I am the father of a slave. It calls fresh to my mind the separation of husband and wife, stripping, tying up, and flogging, and tearing children from their parents and selling them on the auction block. It calls to mind female virtue, virtue trampled underfoot. But oh, when I remember that my daughter, my only child, is still there, destined to share the fate of all these calamities, it is too much to bear. If ever there was any act of my life while a slave that I have to lament over, it is that of being a father and a husband of slaves. Happy Monday, happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading of Dr. Joy DeGroove's great book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. And I started my reading at the very beginning of chapter 4, which is post-traumatic slave syndrome. So today we are going to learn exactly what post-traumatic slave syndrome is and how it manifests. But before I get to that, I want to do two things real quick. I want to give a shout out to my new patron on Patreon, Stephen L. Steed. Thank you, Stephen L. Steed, for becoming a new patron. Welcome to the family. Welcome to the family. And I also want to give a big thank you to Nair for this book. Nair mailed me the book about Marcus Garvey, and I am very appreciative. I'm thankful. Thank you for the book. I love it when I get books. I really, really do love books. I love reading. I love learning. And this is something I'm definitely adding to my collection. I'm going to read it. I'm going to enjoy it. And, you know, it's all love. And I appreciate Nair. And thank you. So I want to make sure I do that. So to show the people, you know, the love that's out here. So thank you. So as you can see from the first clip and the second clip, we're talking about the trauma. We're talking about the effects of post-traumatic slave syndrome. We're talking about what post-traumatic slave syndrome exactly is, how it came about, why it came about, who it came from, who was it inflicted upon, how long it was inflicted upon, what type of acts were inflicted upon specifically African people, because we're talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome and people of the African diaspora, but specifically Black people in America, right? How does this post-traumatic slave syndrome manifest itself in Black people in America today, right? How does trauma affect people today? So the trauma that we experienced that started in the 1400s, but specifically in America in the 1600s. So the trauma that started then, it lasted for 400 years, and all of the trauma after that leading up to today. How did it affect us? How does slavery affect Black Americans today? And why should slavery affect Black Americans today? These are things that we're getting into. So jumping back into page 113, trauma's effects. All right. What are the impacts of generations of slavery and oppression on the people? In order to begin to understand the magnitude of this legacy on contemporary African Americans, it is important to examine the diagnostic characteristics of trauma. What are the effects of trauma on human beings? What does trauma look like? How does the trauma manifest itself, right? If I someone, say an attendee at one of my lectures, most would agree that the victim of the shooting would be severely traumatized. A gentleman seated a few rows away from the victim might be somewhat less traumatized. Someone walking in the hall that heard the could possibly be traumatized. Some family members of the victim informed about the may be intensely traumatized, while others very little. There might even be a woman seated next to the victim who may not experience any symptoms of trauma whatsoever. This is because human beings react to events differently, right? So we know that. Laying the groundwork, right? With the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York on September 11, 2001, and I talked about this before, right? Many Americans once again became familiar with the term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, right? Lots of citizens were reported to be suffering from the disorder as a result of witnessing the destruction of those buildings and the deaths of those trapped inside. At the same time, while most individuals who repeatedly witnessed the news coverage of the towers toppling did not seem to suffer any enduring mental or emotional damage, some did, right? People do indeed respond to traumas differently. With what is known about trauma, it is probable that significant numbers of African slaves experienced a significant amount of trauma to warrant a diagnosis of PTSD, right? Since there are no living African American slaves today, I would have to hypothesize using current diagnostic criteria. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, revised, describes features of disorders, reports the conditions which may give rise to them, and list each disorder's symptoms. These all help clinicians with making accurate diagnoses, right? However, it is not necessary for an individual to show evidence of all of the listed symptoms. So you don't have to show evidence of everything to warrant being diagnosed with a specific illness. The following are a list of some of the conditions which give rise to mental and or emotional traumas that justify the diagnosis of PTSD. So we're laying this groundwork now. We're laying this groundwork. So here are some of the conditions, right? A serious threat or harm to one's life or physical integrity. A threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or close relative. Sudden destruction of one's home or community. Seeing another person injured or killed as a result of accident or physical violence. Learning about a serious threat to a relative or a close friend being kidnapped. Stressor is experienced with intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Stressor and disorder is considered to be more serious and will last longer when the stressor is of human design. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All 7 of them are examples of conditions which give rise to mental and or emotional traumas that justify the diagnoses of PTSD, right? So it is important to note that the manual states that any one of these above stressors is enough to cause PTSD. So once again, you don't have to have all of the conditions, all of the symptoms. You can display one or more. So what about African slaves? Many slaves did not experience just one of the above stressors. Rather, many experienced all of them. And the great preponderance of slaves were subjected to these traumatic experiences over and over again, right? Taking into consideration the fact that slaves brought to the Americas from Africa were exposed to a lifetime of traumas, even with the fact that not everyone is traumatized by traumatic events, anyone with limited astuteness could surmise that a considerable number of African slaves are likely to have suffered from PTSD. If you got any type of reasoning in your mind, in your brain, somewhere in there, you already know that African slaves suffered PTSD. Look at the conditions that they lived in, and we're going to go into more detail, right? Today, those who are diagnosed with PTSD exhibit symptoms that may require clinical treatment, inclusive of drug therapy, right? Some of the symptoms of PTSD include, PTSD symptoms: intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of an traumatic event. Physiological reactivity on exposure to internal or external cues. Marked diminished interest or participation in significant activities. Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. Restricted range of effect. Sense of Foresighting future, in other words, does not expect to have a career, marriage, or children, or normal lifespan. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. Irritability or outburst of anger and difficulty concentrating.